All right, are we good? Is this thing on? Okay. Well, good morning, sports fans. We are coming at you live through the power of the internet to bring you an exciting presentation in the EA 665 Professional Project Series. We've got thrills, we've got chills, your ticket pays for the whole seat. You only need the edge. Dr. Graham and I are proud to bring you estimating alveolar ventilation for use in physiological-based exposure models. Oh no, it's all gone wrong. There we go. My name is Hayden Robertson. I'm the MC for this evening. I'm 32 years old. I got my bachelor's of science in environmental science at UNCW. Go Seahawks. Not only do I have a bachelor's of science, I am also an eligible bachelor. I enjoy long walks on the beach, curling up with a good book, if anyone's interested. So let's talk about the Apex model here. All right, so starting at square one, the PC-based Apex air pollutants exposure model is a component of the probabilistic National Ambient Air Quality Standard exposure model for carbon monoxide. It operates as a component of TRIM, the total risk integrated methodology. Apex functions as a human inhalation exposure model aspect of that. It tracks inhalation exposure over time and through space. Because unlike Tom Cruise in Minority Report, we do not have 3 psychics and a hot tub to make predictions for us. We have to use math. So the total risk integrated methodology, the EPA uses Apex to inform creation of national ambient air quality standards. The last time this data was updated was 20 years ago. So we're due for another look at it. So our objectives: to perform a QA/QC on the existing data, search for additional, more recent applicable studies, add that data to the collection, perform summary statistics for all that data, organize to observe the various relationships between certain variables, and then we make our observations, draw our conclusions, pitch suggestions for the future of inhalation exposure modeling. And I will walk through all these things later. So before we get into the calculation aspects of it, we have to define the terms and become comfortable with the concepts that we're using here. So this is a little fun exercise. I decided to perform a street survey down on downtown Raleigh to see how many people just walking on the street would care to explain to me the intricacies of alveolar ventilation, and the results might surprise you. 90% of those surveyed said, please leave me alone. The remaining 10% said, for some reason, I'm sorry, I don't have any cash. Are these results relevant? No. Are they conclusive? Yes. But on a serious note, let's break down terminology. Total ventilation, also referred to as tidal volume. Now we need to understand from the get-go, and there is an understanding that our lungs are not 100% efficient. When we inhale, we don't take every molecule of oxygen from that volume of air and convert it to carbon dioxide and then exhale that. We understand that there's kind of a room for error. There's kind of a margin there. So we need to break down everything that happens in the mechanics once air is inhaled, how it works getting into the pulmonary capillaries, and then what is exhaled. We have to have terms for all these things and quantify all these things so we can perform our estimations. So once air, upon being inhaled, once it enters the airway, it is total ventilation. So everything that comes here on out falls under that umbrella. Now, alveolar ventilation, that's the air that successfully gets down and reaches the alveoli to where it becomes a candidate for gas exchange. So the VO2 is the portion of the alveolar ventilation, being a portion of total ventilation. The VO2, now that is the actual gas exchange oxygen that enters our pulmonary capillaries. So that's the successfully internalized O2. Now, for all of the volumes of air that did not have their O2 participating in gas exchange, we refer to that as dead space. The anatomical dead space, kind of like alveolar ventilation, but the unsuccessful version of it, that's the air that does successfully reach the alveoli. However, it does not participate in gas exchange and enter the capillaries. We have the physiological dead space that kind of accounts for everything else. All the air that we took in, all of the total ventilation that never participated in gas exchange and didn't even reach the area where it would have been a candidate to participate in gas exchange. And so what we'll see later is once air reaches the alveoli, our lungs are pretty darn efficient at getting that into the capillaries. So for the purposes of a lot of the quantifications that we're going to see and the equations that we see, physiological and anatomical dead space are consolidated because the effect on estimations from ruling out anatomical would be considered to be negligible. So we have just ventilatory dead space. That's the amalgamated total of physiological and anatomical. And I'm really proud of this little man. I made this little guy here. I was actually really surprised to see and how over 200 sources concerning respiratory studies, ventilatory dead space, alveolar ventilation, I didn't see many visual representations of the terms, which is funny because normally I'm not a data visualization kind of guy, but I found myself very often as I was learning these terms having to go backwards and then remind myself, okay, which one's physiological, which one's anatomical, which one's alveolar, which one's physiological. So I just made this little guy. He's just a little public domain guy that I kind of drew over, but I'm proud of it and I think it's useful. And I think maybe someone with a little more graphic design talent might be able to make something very, very useful out of this little vision I put together here. So we've talked about inhaled air. Let's talk about the exhaled air. So I call this guy PECO, just for my references. So if you ever heard me say that, that's what I'm talking about. That is our combination, our mixture of CO2 and O2 and expired air. Because like we said, we don't use and internalize all of the O2 in the inhaled air. And then we have what I call PACA, the arterial partial pressure. Now, the cool thing about this guy is he can be directly measured. He can also be approximated, but the direct measurement via a draw is available for this guy, which makes him very handy and also makes the measurements we get for him pretty spot on. And then we have the uppercase A version, called PACO. That is our alveolar partial pressure. Now, just like we were talking about with dead space, and just like we were talking about with alveolar versus physiological, the anatomic dead space impact negligible, right? So for the purpose of our comparisons, when we take this expired air to hold it next to dead space, BDVT, PACO, PECO, they're considered equivalent because of that that minimal impact on the efficiency and what that does to our estimated values. I'm sure some of you've seen Bohr's equation before. That's where this plays in here, to calculating or estimating our BDVT using measurements we take from expired air via approximation or direct measurement. Here's my guy again. He's so nice, I had to show him twice. All right, so now it's equation time. So so later on, I'll talk to you about how a lot of the data that's used in the pre-existing, the Apex model as it operates today, using a lot of older data. Now, for a lot of these things, what needed to be done was they were kind of yielding measurements and values approximate to what is our area of interest. A lot of times these guys had to be derived. We had to get these, we kind of had to coax out those values via various approximation methods. And also the big whammy for this presentation today is going to be us talking about the coefficient and us pitching a new coefficient. So in the paper, this is all walked through much more diligently. But for the purpose of today's presentation, I want to get to the work that I did. So if you don't mind, we are just going to blast through these equations that were used to get us up to the point where we're at today. So here we go. Buckle up. You got to get the total ventilation. You got to account for body mass, age, and sex. You got to take another look at oxygen consumption. You got to calculate the volumes of breath. You got to consolidate bed spaces, run it as a ratio, install the flux capacitor. That's important. Look at the CO2 levels. Use the conversion factor K equivalent to 8.63. There we go, right there. Factor in the respiratory quotient. You refer back to Bohr's equation. You recite an incantation. Then you introduce the constant C. You rearrange for ratios. Here's the quadratic version over here. And then you implement derivatives, and you perform a virgin sacrifice. Do not forget to carry the 1. And that leads us to where we are right now, and our magic number that we are going to be dealing with today, 19.63. That's our big boy. And we're going to have quite a payoff for this. This is how he's applied. This is what we used for eventually what we call our COHD, our carboxyhemoglobin, which is the end point for the exposure modeling here. So this is one of the biggest steps to get us to our point. That's our conversion factor used in alveolar ventilation estimation. So we are going to come back to that, but we're dealing with this conversion factor here. A little bit of drama behind this guy. This is the quantitative risk and exposure assessment for carbon monoxide amended hearing. 19.63 was disputed as being inadequate in estimating VO2 VA relationships. It was said that there should be a non-linear relationship, and among other things, it did argue that there was inadequate data, and everybody agreed with that. Dr. Graham and the EPA agreed with a lot of these complaints with lack of data and understanding relation. Who doesn't want more data? So that wasn't really a point of contention. And this is where the objectives of this project begin. Dr. Graham actually does not know I have this, but I do have an artist's depiction of his reaction upon receiving news that his coefficient was being challenged. That's it right there. I like to give him a hard time. No, he knows that his argument held water. Dr. Graham did kick the football. I am only giving him a hard time. Now, so once I received the data set, a screening was conducted, a quick little QA/QC on all the data that we had there. So what I did for that was I just looked at, everything. I looked at the methods used to derive the values that were derived up to that point. I read through all of the sources that we had, made sure everything lined up, everything checked out. I didn't make really any changes or any edits. Due to the age of some of the sources, like I said, the values had to be estimated. Sometimes they had to be estimated just straight from the plots. But everything as far as we could see it, all fell within range of expected values. And as we added more data, all our values stayed comfortably where we would expect them to be. I don't really have any concerns about any of the precision of the pre-existing data. Everything feels comfortable there. So my second step, I personally, just me, I personally set out with the goal of doubling the amount of data that we had in the pre-existing data. It sounded good. It sounded fun. It felt like a good benchmark, a good metric for kind of quantifying my contributions. So that was what I set out to do. I did have some criteria. Now I used any applicable studies that I could find using methods that worked for what we were doing. But I did put a very specific focus on publishments 2004 to present day, because the data that we had up until that point only went up to 2004. So I wanted to add kind of more recent studies. So that's where the majority of my effort was focused. And again, we only use data from healthy individuals. A lot of these studies really like to revolve around COPD patients or heart failure patients. At first, I found myself just discarding those papers immediately, but then learned later that I could still use those controls. So I went back and I used control data as long as it's healthy individuals, right? So I was able to really increase the volume of my sources by going back and doing that, not having so much prejudice in selecting my sources. I was happy to see that for the most part, measurement and exercise testing methods were pretty uniform. Pretty much for the vast majority of any kind of respiratory study that I could find, it's treadmills or ergonomic cycles. This is the vast majority of it, and most people's methods for doing activity levels were uniform as well. A lot of times what they do is they bring in somebody and then they incrementally have them work up to what they consider to be their peak, or they start experiencing discomfort either from breathing or heart rate or muscle soreness. And so they have them, they have them stop there, and then they call that their peak. And then they assign, a W to that depending on speed or the resistance to the bike. And then they go back, they have them come back another day or after resting or after a week. And then they have them perform 20% of what was their peak, 40, 60, 80. So then they go back and they get those values. So you can find low, moderate, high, peak intensities of activity levels. Yeah, the absolute vast majority of everybody I looked at doing any kind of activity related respiratory studies all fell within those methods. Not a whole lot of complications there. So we're pretty comfortable with the methods on these sources as well. Very few unit conversions were necessary. There were a few times I think I had a Chinese source, and then I think some of the data concerning infants, so there were some unit conversions that needed to be done. So it really wasn't a big deal there. So there's not a lot of uncertainty in conversions at the end of the day. Like it's very solid. Now, most of our measurements, now because a lot of the respiratory studies we were looking at there, they don't have the same end goals or areas of concern that Dr. Graham and I had. So a lot of times they didn't contain everything we would have liked to have had, even if they had VA, VD, VT, VO2, like they wouldn't have partial expired values. But I mean, that's a lot to ask if you're not measuring for exposure, or you're not caring about gas exchange, you're only caring about breathing rates and things like that. So that's to be expected. But so there weren't a lot of perfect sources for our purposes, but we were able to use still appropriately taken values from all kinds of different measurements. So what I had to work with originally contained 109 data points from 21 sources, and a lot of those data points are means. Even if we have some papers that have a lot of individual values, we do, standard deviations and means, and we consolidate those into one data point. And by the time I was finished, we have 193 data points from 38 sources. And I am considering my goal of doubling the initial amount of data I had to work with. I'm considering that goal reached. Because even though you might say, well, I didn't double data points, I didn't double sources, when you look at the points of interest for us, VD, VT, VA, VO2, when it comes to those measurements, I was effectively able to contribute about twice as many. So mission accomplished, pat on the back there for it. So now we've got to crunch these numbers. So I performed the QA/QC on the data that I collected. Perform those very few unit conversions that were necessary. And then we have to categorize and separate this data and draw the relationships that we're interested in looking at and form summary statistics. All right, and now we get to dive into it. Here is the entree for this evening. We observe the relationships and linearity of variable arrangements Linear relationship strengthened, uncertainties were decreased, confidence was increased. There are some uncertainties and assumptions that do persist following this. So here we go. These are our exponential plots. This is the pre-existing plot here on the left. This is the new VD to VT VO2 plot. So this is our relationship here. Now you can see how some of that data I added. We've expanded the range of these measurements. You see that on the VO2, our old guy really only goes up to 3.5. Our new guy goes up to 5. And we can see with these values over here on the lower right, and how they extend that range to how they still fall about within the expected range of values of where we would want them to be. So that was cool. That increases our confidence here. Now you see the difference in our regressions here. And so something that's kind of be a recurring theme from here on out is that the amount of data that we have for a young and an old demographic considerably more scarce than the 19 to 35 age group. We have a lot of data for that age group. We feel very good about how tight a lot of the fits are within that age group. And naturally, because of what I was telling you about, a lot of respiration studies, it's kind of understandable that there is considerably less data for older and infants and toddlers and children. That's going to be an area that we need to continue to look at. I'll get to that part in the conclusion section. But what we really like here, and who the star of our show is for VD/VT to VO2, is the adults 19 to 35. And keep in mind too, with what I was talking to you about in the terminology about how these things are measured, VD/VT often has to be approximated, not directly measured. So it is a trickier thing to look for. And also it is a thing that not a lot of people are interested in quantifying whenever we look at certain respiratory studies. So this was the harder sell here. This was the tougher relationship to represent. And still though, with all that being said, for that blue group there, 19 to 35, I am satisfied with the fit that we got there. So I'm happy with that result. I hope Dr. Graham is as well. That kind of goes over what I was just telling you. Dead space more difficult. Tidal volume going to learn dead space, not directly measured. Yep, there's very much a demand for more respiratory data on children and older individuals. And I wanted to just do a brief mention here on something that I might be interested in looking at in the future, and maybe others would be as well, that when I was looking over sources and screening for data that I wanted to use here, I came across a lot of information talking about people pitching further development of lung function MRI imaging. And it really kind of made me interested in perhaps possibly there is a way that with developments in the field of like imaging, it might be able that it might eventually be an ability of ours to quantify air. A lot of times we are looking at lung function through MRI imaging, but if we could find a way to quantify air as well, that would give us a pretty decent means to estimate VD/VT in a much more direct way. So I'd be interested to see what developments in that field and how they might eventually yield benefits to exposure modeling. So just something I was thinking about as I was ruling out MRI lung imaging papers. So here we have our VA to VO2. Now this guy, VA VO2, this is kind of like our celebrity cameo for this morning. These are the exponential plots. And the reason why I'm showing you these exponential plots is because in that dispute against 19.63 that I mentioned earlier, where it was argued that this relationship is probably going to be nonlinear. I wanted to show you the exponential version of this. Um, so, but I'm going to get to the linear next because that's where it shines. But as you can see, compare this old to this new here, and you look at this new plot, and see that the exponential probably does not serve us as well as this. So it does appear as though this relationship is linear. Look at that fit on the new. It's beautiful. Look at that. Look at that 9-3 there. That's a wonderful sight. And then when there's an old relationship, 0.89. So this was very exciting, reassuring to see. All right. I just wanted to give you this little hint here. Our new model. Take a look down here at this coefficient. Set the intercept 0. This guy right here. 26.35. Dr. Graham and I, this is what we're getting to. This right here. Remember back to 19.63? Our VA equals this guy, times VO2. This is our guy right here. And we are pitching that as a superior coefficient. So from this, we can see that with this new data added, and with the previously used 19.63, we were actually underestimating. We had a lower respiratory quotient. So that would have given us, an underestimation of carboxyhemoglobin levels eventually in the model. The endpoint, what we're trying to model for and what we're trying to estimate for. So that guy right there, we're making the argument that this is a more representative coefficient to use. So very excited to have gotten that result. It's a lot of fun. And let me show you some of the data analysis using this new model. So here we have our normal probability plot. Let's say with our VA means. And here's another kind of assembly of that, a residual plot. See, we're looking pretty good. And, and keep in mind that, some of the more erratic values, children, older people, remember that model with the red triangles. That was a little more erratic, but this guy still looking good, all falls within expected ranges. And then this beautiful guy here, the VO2 mean line fit plot. That was very, very pretty. So I'm considering project success. We have increased the range and strength of the relationship as expected. Alveolar ventilation does remain efficient. We got our linear relationship there. Both measurements increase. There's a tight relationship as activity levels increase. Small sample sizes for young and old, they slightly skew some of the data. That was a consistent theme. We need more data for those younger or older people, or we at least need to adjust the way that we go about estimating exposure for those different age groups. Also, this is something I talk about more in the paper than I have here in the presentation. We could benefit from more female data. A lot of people were interested in doing respiratory studies for pre and postnatal ladies, and we could use some, some normal, not pregnant female information. So is there a new model in town? You guys tell me, but this was a lot of fun. I was beside myself to be a part of this opportunity. And I am now going to bring us to our conclusion. So thank you guys very, very much.
And that was awesome, Hayden. I really like that you took the time to make that figure. I think that's kind of surprising that it wasn't, like your little man. I'm surprised that that didn't exist somewhere, but that's really cool.
Yeah, I
Um,
didn't see anything like that in any of the studies, and I thought if I could benefit from it, it's worth.
yeah, yeah.
Um,
Seems like a simple thing that people who are especially, just starting out learning about it, you know, some people are very visual. Um, I guess my big question for you and Dr. Graham is, what's the process like to get this, accepted, I guess, as the new coefficient? Because it seems kind of like, maybe there's a lot of history, behind that other number. So how does that happen, I guess?
Yeah, well, I can answer that question. I mean, there's certainly review that is going to be needed, and of course, it would have to be done in a fully transparent public forum eventually. What Hayden has done here has definitely laid the groundwork for pushing this forward into potentially the next review. Unfortunately, I'm no longer in the air office. I'm in the pesticide office, so it would have been an easier transition. But nevertheless, I still communicate with the folks over there. And my next step would be to reach out to them and let them know that we have some thoughts on making an improvement here to this. So yeah, that's kind of the process.
Okay.
Yeah, and I did also want to comment about that football and Lucy. It is
uh,
funny. No. It is funny because when I had the conversation with Hayden about this project, literally, we had finished up this review, and these typically take, a number of years. And one of my former colleagues, who I consider him my mentor and friend, he, I don't want to say shredded what I did, but in a public forum, he submitted comments that were questioning all of these things that I did. And I called him on the phone after, I saw the comments. I'm like, why are you doing this? But you know what? The reason why he's doing it is because that's the scientific process. And I knew, in my communications with him over the years that this 19.63 was an issue, but there's so many issues that you have to address in these reviews. And at that time, I was like, well, yeah, I know that there's some issues with it, but it's not going to be a big deal. And in the end, it isn't a huge thing, but knowing that it does result in what we would call a bias, there's potential for underestimation. That's not a good thing. And we're always looking for incremental improvements to all the information that we have when we go through these reviews. So I just wanted to comment on that. I don't know if I hit the football, but it wasn't totally swiped away from me.
and I had to hold myself back. I was going to push the envelope much further. And in my head, I was thinking like, oh, I can show like maybe like Obi-Wan versus Vader, or Gandalf and Saruman, or maybe like William Shatner and Khan. Like I have got, and I was like, you know what? I'm going to stick with peanuts. I don't want to see how much I can get away with. So
It's a good policy. So, yeah, I think this project was really, really great. It's, we don't often see projects that are so, potentially immediately useful, like on that big scale. And that's not exactly the way I wanted to say that, but I think you know what I mean. So yeah, I'm glad that you had the opportunity to, get a taste for data analysis.
yeah, I did that. I did that. Yeah.
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 I enjoyed your slide with all the equations that you just popped up super quick. This is probably the most entertaining mathematical presentations I've seen. So well done. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. I had hoped, I told my friends and colleagues how much humor I plan to inject in this, and everyone was like, no, Hayden, don't. And I was like, no. I wanted to give you guys a representative example of my public speaking style, right? So, there you go.
Yeah. I think it works. So yeah, great job.
Thank you. So what happens now?
Yeah. I guess if there's no other questions, I think you're done. So,
Thank you, Mr. Goodell. I appreciate it.
so as we talked about, you'll just make those final changes.
Mhm.
And